is the Weft and the Wow of the China-EU strategic partnership. So, in the last few years, there have been some important shifts in the China and the European Union relations. In 2003, the European Union announced that it had launched a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. This policy was intended to elevate EU-China relations beyond its prosaic trade and the investment issues to address some of the world's most pressing political and security challenges. However, anything approaching a comprehensive strategic partnership over the past decade linking the EU and the China has failed to materialize. In 2019 also, the EU labeled China as an economic competitor and a systemic rival. Since then, the areas of the divergences seem to have only grown stronger. While there is a little doubt about the changing dynamic in the China-EU ties, the magnitude of the change is yet to be ascertained. As two of the strongest economic actors, China and the EU still consider one another important for the economic prosperity. Therefore, this webinar would attempt in clarifying and examining the fundamentals of the China-EU strategic partnership in order to determine if the partnership will be able to withstand the recent strains caused by the China's inaction with regards to Ukraine especially. Also, it explains how it would explain how clashing political values, diverging geopolitical interests and priorities, and the competing conceptions of world order has limited and will continue to limit the scope and the depth of any of the EU and the China strategic partnership. EU-China relations today are likely to remain contested, uneven, apart from the trade and the investment, and embody a limited rather than a strategic partnership. Also, as China's economic, military, and the political power continues to expand, the EU will definitely need a new conceptual framework towards Beijing. This framework must be able to facilitate cooperation on the issues and the policies in which there is real potential for the mutual gain, but also manage effectively the inevitable tensions and the disagreements that arise in the changing world order. So, for this session, we have it will be it will be able to hear me?
Some problem in the audio, Parul?
I think Parul has dropped out. Maybe connectivity issues.
Oh, all right. Just as she was about to say that we have fortunately managed to snaggle Gulshan Sachdeva, who happens to be very well known in his field of European studies, in addition to also having supervised the thesis of our young presenter today. So we are very fortunate in having both kind of an insider's perspective on Preksha's, unfolding academic journey, but also a keen and discerning eye on what the outcome of that journey has been. And in addition to that, I'm hoping that Gulshan would also make some broad assessments about the very important theme that is for discussion today. So I am going to now hand the baton to Gulshan to start and take charge of the seminar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alka Acharya, and thank you again to Institute of Chinese Studies. Glad to be back in your webinar series and giving me this opportunity to chair this particular very important session. And I'm really glad because the main presentation is Dr. Preksha Chetri. We have been working on this topic for the last many years now. So, and she's going to present a couple, whatever she has been learning about EU and China. Now, and it's not just only about, since she has been following, EU-China issues for last 6-7 years now. So it's not just only about a few recent news reports and development, which normally sometime you can read and try to make assessment. So she's going to, as the title of this topic itself, she says the Weft and Rap of the EU-China strategic partnership. So this is much bigger canvas in which she's going to look at. Now, if you look at in the last 2-3 years, there are a lot of media reports, and there are also think tank reports, which try to kind of indicate that there are some kind of tension building up between Europe or Europe/EU and China. Now, some of these reports are based on issues, specific issues, say concerning problems between Lithuania and China. They had some kind of showdown in the last 1 or 2 years. There are also mutual sanctions on certain individuals and entities from both sides. There are certain problems with the ratification of the investment agreement between China and the EU. And there are also certain worries in the European Union about BRI projects in its periphery. And then, of course, China's no-limit friendship with Russia, and particularly after Ukraine war, as Europe is so much invested in that area. So, many of those reports do indicate that there are certain kind of tension building up. And in the last few days, we have also seen reports that after Lithuania, both Latvia and Estonia, they have also left China's 17+ initiative in Eastern Europe. Now, these problems are real, but there are also, I find, many reports coming from Western think tanks and also sometimes Indian reports also, which are more of wishful thinking of building serious tensions between China and the European Union. So one has to look into these specific developments within the broader long-term Chinese and European understanding of each other. Now, we all know that, EU and China are both economic heavyweights. Both play a very important role in different institutions of global governance. Economically, they are also deeply engaged with each other. If you look at today, their bilateral trade, both in goods and services, it's going to be close to $700 billion. It means basically roughly about 2 billion worth of goods and services are exchanged every day between EU and China. So this kind of engagement led to their strategic partnership, about 20 years back in 2003. And since then, they have also built, very strong, huge institutional mechanism with more than 50 dialogues and different kind of mechanism and working groups. In fact, initially, some of the scholars, labeled, EU-China's partnership, when they signed a partnership of the century. But this kind of initial enthusiasm from both sides, led to kind of later years into more sober and mature ties. Still, in fact, if you look at, I'm not just looking at just few recent reports, I'm saying if you look at all the policy papers coming both from EU and also from China in the last 20 years, both have looked at each other particularly the economic strengths of each other as huge economic opportunities. So apart from the European Union, like we also have strategic partnership. Similarly, China also has strategic partnership with the European Union. Now, apart from EU, like we also have other separate strategic partnerships with the UK, Germany, France, but China's other bilateral partnerships are even longer. I mean, the list is longer. They also have not just only with the UK, Germany, and France, they also have with Italy, also with Spain, with Portugal, with Poland. And last few years, they have also signed those kind of strategic partnerships with Greece, with Hungary, with Czech Republic, with Serbia. And then, of course, they had also established the 17 plus dialogues with the countries mainly in Central and Eastern Europe. And they also signed this comprehensive agreement on investment, which at the moment is frozen. And within their own paper, as Parul was mentioning earlier, EU has labeled China as strategic rival and economic competitor. But still, my feeling is that broadly still doesn't want to be on the wrong side of rising powers. So they try to kind of balance its economic engagements and other worries with more engagements and more kind of concerns and more dialogues, etc. Even if you look at, the current narrative, particularly in this region now on the Indo-Pacific. Now, as we know that, many of the European countries, particularly you look at UK and then Germany, France, Netherlands, and also now the EU, they have come out with its own Indo-Pacific approaches or strategies. But, initially, I think the European approach towards Indo-Pacific was somewhat ambivalent. But now it's clear, as far as Europe is concerned, China is very much part of the Indo-Pacific. Now, in India also, we talked about, inclusive Indo-Pacific. In fact, everybody talks about inclusive Indo-Pacific. But in most conversations on Indo-Pacific and Quad, if you look at, the idea, if you look at from the US, from India, from Japan, it's something like, building some kind of collective platform or different grouping against kind of assertive China. Now, EU is also worried about assertive China, but, it doesn't want to be part of the kind of geopolitical competition what you have between the US and China in this Indo-Pacific region. So it really sincerely favors inclusive Indo-Pacific and of course, centrality of ASEAN, but of course, China is also very much part of this narrative of the European narrative where they have very extensive economic presence in this region, and they want to kind of preserve that economic presence even when the economic kind of geopolitical rivalries are building in this part. So the overall, I would find that the fundamentals of partnerships are strong, as in fact, as I think the abstract of Preksha's talk also talked about this. But there is also global geopolitics. And within that global geopolitics, Europe is very much part of the transatlantic alliance. So, and there are, of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are certain areas where there is certain stress. So one has to look at the situation in totality and make certain assessments of future trajectories. And this is what I think that Dr. Preksha Shri Chetri is going to do in the next half an hour or so. Since she's not just following only recent developments, which all of us are doing, but she has looked at this relationship for the last 6-7 years, how this thing have developed really the last 2-3 decades, and the kind of institutional mechanism, institutional structures which Europe and China have built, and how those kind of strong fundamentals are going to kind of face the current strains and stress and challenges what this relationship is facing, and in the context of course what's going on in Ukraine and the very close ties what Russia has with China. This is, of course, has added new worries. So Europeans are quite happy if other players like India, United States, and others, they put certain pressures on China, but they also would like to be engaged with China at the same time. They don't really want to be the part of geopolitical competition here. So these are kind of broad my assessment of this, the way things have been happening. But of course, Preksha would know much better because she has done this work. So over to you, Preksha. The next 30 minutes or so. And then after that, if there are any specific questions, you can raise your hand electronically, or you can put your question in the chat box. If there is any specific query in between, also you can ask. Yeah, Dr. Preksha.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for agreeing to chair and for introducing the topic so well. I feel like I'm going to be repeating the exact same points. Let me first share my screen so that I can present my PPT. Okay, it's working. First of all, thank you, Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, Alka ma'am, and ICS for supporting and encouraging my research. So as Sir said, recently, Beijing has launched economic and diplomatic sanctions against Lithuania, and in retaliation for its expanded ties with Taiwan. In response, Estonia and Latvia, other Baltic states, have left the China-backed East Europe Forum. A week back, the EU as an institution and Europeans in general, they showed immense disappointment in Beijing owing to the inaction about the war on Ukraine. 1 year back, previously, the long-awaited comprehensive agreement on investment was failed to be ratified by the European Parliament. In the last 5 years, there have been many instances where which have shown the withering ties between China and EU. We're all reading news headlines such as these, where they focus on the withering ties between the two strategic partners. But if we take a moment and take a closer look at these issues and measure the impact that they've actually had on the partnership, the picture is quite disproportionate. There's no doubt that China is readjusting that EU is readjusting its China policy, but the nature of these changes or adjustments are uncertain. Through my presentation, I'm attempting to explain how the new issues are straining China-EU strategic partnership, but how sweeping reformations which will completely alter the course of the strategic partnership is unlikely, because the foundation of the strategic partnership is supported by two strong factors. One is the economic benefits that both China and EU receive from one another, and the other would be strong institutional mechanism. So like Parul said, over the last few years, there's been some important shifts in China-EU strategic partnership. In 2019, the European Union labeled China as an economic competitor and a systemic rival. And since then, the areas of divergence seem to have only grown. Today, the areas of cooperation or convergences seem rather limited. Now, against this backdrop, it is the aim of my presentation to understand the basic foundations of China-EU strategic partnership and to see if the new strains in this partnership is going to have a long-term impact. And if yes, to what extent? China and EU are strategic partners since 2003. But what exactly does this mean? What does a strategic partnership entail, and what is the significance of such a partnership? These are some of the questions that I'd like to address before diving into a discussion about strengths versus challenges. I do this because understanding the kind of partnership that EU and China have built over a period of 19 years is important to gauge the current scenario, and it may also come in handy in providing some trends for the future. So what is a strategic partnership? For a term that is widely used by scholars, policymakers, and news media, strategic partnership is not a very well-defined concept. They initially emerged as a new feature of international relations after the end of the Cold War, when in order to help countries organize their foreign relations according to their needs and interests. Now, the end of bipolarity, coupled with acceleration of globalization, resulted in a number of bilateral and multilateral relations in various formats. Like in the 19th century was called the era of conference diplomacy. The 20th century was called the era of international organization. And the 21st century was called the era of summit diplomacy. But basically, strategic partnerships broadly reflect a country or country's foreign policy priorities. But as a theory of international, it has not been explicitly defined. Neither China nor EU has officially defined what strategic partnership is. Now, because this concept is not very well defined, many IR theorists have criticized it as having no real significance. Some even say that strategic partnerships are merely symbolic upgrade of relationships. However, China and EU have taken a sort of glass full approach, and they've taken the most advantage of the flexibility of this concept and molded it to suit their needs and interests. So initially, the partnership was purely economic in nature, but over time, the scope has increased. For example, in 1978, when they started out, the European Economic Community and the PRC formed Joint Committee for Trade Only. By 1985, they included economic cooperation in other fields like industry, mining, and agriculture. Similarly, in 1998, they included scientific and technological cooperation as well. And finally, in 2003, they decided to become comprehensive strategic partners, which means they included a wide variety of areas. Now, though external factors such as globalization, China's rising economic and political weight, EU's growing interest towards Asia, and EU's enlargement aspirations contributed to the growth of this partnership, economic benefits that EU and China received from one another can be considered the primary driving force for the partnership even today, and especially today. While economic interests of both China and EU led to the partnership in the first place, soon they recognized each other's importance as regional actors, and they started to cooperate on a variety of areas. Such cooperation is based on a wide and expansive network of dialogue mechanism that EU and China have built over a period of 19 years. Aside from helping in cooperation, the institutional mechanism put in place by the two sides also serve as problem-solving mechanism, and as has been seen in many instances in the past. And they also help the two sides compartmentalize the areas of divergences and convergences, which is why despite some serious strains in the partnership, trade between them continue to remain strong. Since I intend to use the greater portion of time allotted to me in discussing the challenges faced by China and EU, I'm going to quickly demonstrate the vast and detailed nature of the dialogue mechanism that they have through my slides. So as can be seen from the first, as can be seen from the picture, the dialogue mechanism includes the annual summit at the very top, followed by three pillars of political dialogue, economic and sectoral dialogues, and the people-to-people dialogues. The annual summits, both EU and China efficiently maintain a detailed record of the annual summits. Many of the strategic partners do not do this. So far, there have been 23 China-EU summits. The latest one was held in April. The annual summits are normally also followed by publication of joint statements, which help in understanding the progress and new developments in the partnership on an annual basis. Second, we have the first pillar, which is the high-level political dialogue. As can be seen from the slide, the high-level political dialogue includes dialogues in a number of areas, also including locations like Central Asia or Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Then we have the most important pillar, which is the economic and sectoral dialogues. The economic and sectoral dialogues make the second pillar, and they are growing in number because both EU and China seem to have similar approaches to new areas like education, environment, space technology, and even connectivity. At present, there are more than 60 sectoral dialogues between the two, and each of these sectoral dialogues further facilitate cooperation through meticulously planned projects. For example, if I were to randomly pick one of the sectoral dialogues and zoom in, we'll find that the projects under them, I've taken connectivity as an example. So when we look at the chart, there are a number of connectivity projects in China and in the EU where the two sides are collaborating. Likewise, if we take a closer look at any of the other sectoral dialogues, 60, we will be able to find a similar array of projects and teams dedicated for such projects. Then we have a people-to-people dialogue, which was launched in 2012 with an intention of enhancing knowledge between the two sides. Now, apart from these dialogues, there are a few other important dialogues that require more attention from the partnership, like the human rights dialogue. Initially, EU-China human rights dialogue was categorized under the political dialogue, but owing to a huge gap in understanding of human rights between the two sides, now they have a separate dialogue. China is the first and only country with which EU has a separate dialogue on human rights. In comparison, many other strategic partnerships in the world do not match up to what China and EU have built. As discussed earlier, strategic partnership as a theory is neither well-defined nor binding, which is why sometimes countries actually even form strategic partnerships and forget about it immediately. Some of the strategic partnerships aren't able to withstand the test of time, and they even weaken to the extent of being hostile towards one another. For example, India, China are strategic partners, but now they're hostile. US, Russia, same example, and also Russia, Ukraine. And some of the strategic partners, though cordial, may lack ambition like EU, India. Therefore, I argue that China's strategic partnership is with the EU is one of the significant strategic partnership that exists, because both the sides are proactively and continuously committed to building close ties despite serious differences. Now, talking about differences, China and EU are two actors that couldn't have been more different. They have different histories, cultures, economic background, and their core values and ideologies do not match as well. In fact, when it comes to certain ideas and concepts like terrorism or human rights, their understanding varies. We must also be mindful of the fact that EU and China are two dissimilar political entities. One is a regional organization, while the other is a sovereign state. Therefore, the EU and China have fundamental differences which often challenge the partnership. I've taken the liberty of creating a list of challenges that the EU and China have faced in the past, and it also includes the current challenges. First is the arms embargo. So the EU's arms embargo on China, which is still in place, was a repercussion of the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989. The EU imposed an arms embargo condemning the violent suppression of protests using force. The arms embargo has not been lifted even today, despite many attempts from China to have them lifted. However, this is a problem that China and EU have lived with for the past 19 years, and this is not likely to cause any serious disruptions in the partnership. This issue is also discussed regularly during the annual summits. Then we have the issue of China being granted the market economy status. When China became a member of the WTO in 2001, it was suggested that certain provisions of its accession, such as the one dealing with anti-dumping issue, would expire in 2016. China had been expecting to be granted the status of a market economy in 2016, but the EU rejected this claim, as a result of which China was denied the market economy status. This caused problems in the partnership in 2016, but now the two sides are working on it through the high-level economic dialogue. The next irritant in EU-China strategic partnership is human rights. Human rights abuse in China has been one of the biggest challenges to China-EU strategic partnership, but they have formed a separate human rights dialogue. So far, there have been 37 human rights dialogue between them. The latest one took place in Brussels in 2019. Now, under the constructive dialogue mechanism, they raise human rights concerns in China and EU by holding regular and institutionalized confidential dialogue. One of the primary findings of my research during my thesis was how China and EU define human rights differently. As can be seen from a study of these dialogues, China tends to focus more on economic and social rights when talking about human rights, while EU insists that equal weight should be given to political as well as civil rights. During these meetings, the EU also raises important concerns regarding human rights abuse in China. If I were to give an example of how these dialogues work, I'd pick the 36th Human Rights Dialogue, which was held in 2018, where the EU raised several individual cases of political activists in China. One such case, as many in the China Studies Circle would know, is that of Mrs. Liu Xia, who was denied permission to leave home and had guards permanently placed in front of her residence without being guilty of any crime. She was the widow of late Nobel Peace Prize winner who won the Nobel Peace Prize for contributions towards fighting human rights abuse in China and had died in police custody. The EU members, especially Germany, was very keen on this release. Finally, in 2018, the Chinese government allowed her to leave Germany from China. On the screen, I'm also sharing a list of other names of activists that the EU shared during the 36th Human Rights Dialogue. The next challenge would be the issue of 14th Dalai Lama's visit to Europe. This has been marked in red because this is the one and only time when EU-China Annual Summit was cancelled. This happened in 2009. The annual summit was cancelled by Beijing because the French President Sarkozy, his wife, and the French Foreign Minister had met with the 14th Dalai Lama. This was an one-off incident, but it showed the EU what China is most sensitive about. Some of the challenge in the EU-China strategic partnership is not issue-based, but it also pertains to the changing nature or changing aspirations of the actors. Until a few years back, the European Union was very comfortable with its image as an economic actor and a comparatively delicate strategic player. But with changing geopolitical ambience, the EU has been obliged to question its own traditional model, and now it has been focusing on foreign policy. It has been reinventing its role as a political actor. The EU's changing or tough stance on China can be also viewed through this lens. However, on a practical note, since ties between two countries commercially are deep-rooted, sweeping policy reformations may not be possible as imagined by the current EC president. Then there are other issues like the one that influenced the economic partnership, like China's growing footprint in high-tech industries. With China's growing strength, Beijing is also pursuing global leadership in many new sectors, some of which were under EU's influence so far. So what happened in 2013 was Germany came up with a strategy called Industry 4.0. This strategy would bring about the fourth industrial revolution through automation and digital revolution. But just 2 years later, China introduced its own plan called Made in China 2025. Many in Europe believe that China's Made in China 2025 is a response to Germany's Industry 4.0 strategy. Made in China 2025 aims to transform China from a low-end manufacturer to a high-end producer, but it is intimidating to many in the West in many different ways, because it aims not only at focusing on high-end manufacturing, but also gaining technological know-how from EU industries through state support. As Gulshan sir mentioned in the beginning, the 17+1 framework has been problematic for EU-China strategic partnership. In 2012, China came up with a 16+1 dialogue, which became the 17+1 dialogue in 2019 when Greece joined. The primary aim was to focus on economic infrastructure and green technology cooperation with the Central and Eastern European countries. However, this framework has been frowned upon by many in the EU, especially the Western European countries. They view it as China's move to create divisions within the EU. Initially, the 16+1 was viewed as a remarkable opportunity by the Central and Eastern European countries, but strong reservations about it from Central EU institutions have now affected their perception. We also discussed the case of Lithuania in the beginning. Coming to most recent challenges, the EU, China's pandemic response. China's zero COVID strategy has increased the challenge in doing business in China. European corporate leaders are becoming increasingly detached from their Chinese operations, and strict border closures, which had persisted for more than 2 years, is now extending into a third year, which is why 1/4 of European companies in China are reviewing their investments. According to a chamber report, 90% of its respondents were affected by port closures, road freight decrease, and spiraling costs of sea freight. These restrictions have negatively impacted the EU's exports of agricultural products. This issue has been the highlight of the previous high-level economic dialogue. Again, as Professor Sachdeva mentioned in the beginning, there have been sanctions on EU parliamentarians, which have been causing problems. After 7 long years of back and forth negotiation, the comprehensive agreement on investment between China and EU was finally concluded during the pandemic. However, the investment agreement was it failed to be ratified by the EU Parliament as an opposition to sanctions imposed by the Chinese authorities on EU lawmakers and entities. The sanction was again a retaliatory act in response to EU's decision to enact restrictive measures against Chinese officials over the issue of human rights in the Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang region. Now, coming to the final and the most discussed topic, Ukraine. On 1st April 2022, the 23rd EU-China summit took place via video conference. The summit was meant to be an opportunity to put a year of EU-China tensions in the past and to forge new ground for cooperation. But owing to China's inaction about Ukraine, the mood of the summit was visibly dampened, and any expectations of reset were not met. The Chinese authorities have so far refused to fully denounce Russia's unprovoked invasion in its neighbor. So as the war is being fought in a European country that is neighboring EU members, including Poland, Hungary, and Romania, the EU side spoke of its expectations from China to take a stand against Moscow. China's reluctance was noted, and the summit was a clear reminder that the interests of both the sides differ at present, especially when it comes to Ukraine. However, according to experts, ties between China and EU could see minor glitches over Ukraine war, but it is unlikely to have serious impact given the entrenched commercial relationship and impracticality of diversifying supply chains. This brings us to the most pressing challenge in China-EU strategic partnership, which is the challenges in the economic sphere. So although economics is the core of the China-EU strategic partnership, they are facing problems even in this sphere. The most important one being trade deficit. Though the overall trade between China and EU is strong, surplus in favor of China is increasing every year, which has led the EU to readjust its policies. These policies mostly relate to restricted access to Chinese markets and China's disregard for EU's competition rules. Nervousness also stems from the fact that China has started taking over key industries, especially after the 2008 sovereign debt crisis. As EU's competitiveness is dependent to a large extent on its comparative advantage in high-tech and cutting-edge technology, losing its edge in technological know-how is alarming. However, the HED, which was established in 2008, it aims at balancing trade exchange between the two sides, and each HED has a theme. High-level economic dialogue has a theme, and this issue has been discussed by the two sides throughout the dialogue. So as of now, neither China's nor the EU's contribution to global economy can be disregarded. Similarly, China and the EU's contribution to each other's economy cannot be undervalued. In 2021, as Sir mentioned, China surpassed the United States to become EU's largest trading partner. The EU trade in goods with China is worth 695.9 billion in 2001. This is according to Eurostat. This is approximately 1.95 billion euros of trade each day. Unless EU or China finds a trade partner to replace these figures, sweeping shifts in China-EU strategic partnership is quite unlikely. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the period of unconditional engagement between China and EU is definitely over. But considering the volume of trade between the two sides and the inherent weaknesses in many of these challenges that were listed earlier, it is doubtful that any of the factors will act as a watershed moment and change the course of the partnership altogether. Though China is growing assertive and the EU is pursuing its global ambition, there are limits to these changes. The EU is definitely readjusting its China policy, and it intends to act a certain way, but manifesting these intentions into concrete actions might neither be possible nor feasible. One thing that is certain is there are changes, and EU and China right now is at the cusp of change, especially as the ratification of comprehensive agreement on investment is awaited. Meanwhile, both the sides still consider each other for their economic prosperity. The EU and China have efficient problem-solving mechanism. Therefore, despite the new challenges confronting the partnership, the two sides are likely to continue a stable partnership, although very cautiously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Reksha, for very comprehensive and very precise presentation on EU-China strategic partnership. So what you're basically arguing is that although it's a very comprehensive and strong partnership, but there are areas, particularly divergences in certain areas is growing. But at the same time, since they have very strong commercial ties, very strong institutional mechanism built under a strategic partnership, so there may not be any what you call, you have said the watershed movement in any way. So even if some of the Baltic countries, there are certain tensions here or there, but that may not fundamentally change the kind of the relationship what they have China and the European Union. So this is what roughly she has kind of argued. So now we are basically open for discussion. We have roughly about 20 minutes or so for open discussion. If you have any specific comment on this broader topic, and she raised a very important couple of dialogues with what they have. Issue of, like, so you mentioned about human rights dialogue, very interesting human rights dialogue between China and the European Union, and the kind of partnership what they have on connectivity. Although, in fact, most of the time we do read that China, that the European Union is very uncomfortable with the BRI, and some of them, at the same time, some of the member states, of course, are participating. And in fact, if I remember correctly, 2014 or 2015, they already built connectivity partnership between European Union and China. And some of the projects you showed us that they are being working on those. So there are different ways, in fact, things are happening. And, interesting way also I have seen in the last many years, China has also invested a lot of resources to understand European Union and its institutions and its processes. In fact, much more actually we have done in India. So they know precisely how the institutions function, what are the strengths of the European Union are, and where the weaknesses are, how they can deal bilaterally. At the same time, they also know that if they have to deal with the institutions of the European Union, they have to go by some of the rules of the European Union. As you mentioned that, this investment agreement is kind of has not been ratified because it's stuck in the European Parliament because of sanctions against some of the MEPs. So it means any agreement what you have with the European Union, it has to be cleared by the European Parliament, even if everything else has been agreed. So, and the European Parliament, as you know, they have been very vocal on issues concerning human rights, on democracy, and all those kind of issues. So, when we are also negotiating the trade agreement with the European Union, we also should be very clear in our mind that all those agreements will go to the European Parliament. And there has been a clear mandate from the European Parliament to commission that some of these issues concerning human rights, labor standards, sustainability will have to be built in any kind of agreement with the European Union is going to sign with any country. So that's the process. In fact, I think China has been trying to learn and invest for many, many years now. And this is precisely the reason I think they have started human rights dialogue. They know what exactly this dialogue will lead to. Will lead to nothing. But at the same time, whenever those issues will come in the European Parliament, like when whether the investment agreement or other kind of agreements will come into the European Union institution, particularly the European Parliament. So of course, the commissioner then can come and answer that yes, there are issues with human rights violations in China, but for the last many years, we do have this dialogue. So this can kind of checklist, that how do you really deal with the institutions? So this is what I think they have mastered in that sense, how to deal with some of the European Union institutions. But of late, of course, they have not been very successful in dealing with some of these issues. Now, if there are, there is a question from Nishant Sharma to everyone. He said the question from does China pursue different relationships on line with Eastern and Western Europe? So can you just briefly answer, Preksha, this question? Do they follow a separate policy toward what you call the old Europe or Western Europe or New Europe or Eastern Europe?
To answer this question, China has two sorts of relations when it comes to European Union countries. One is with the EU central institutions, with the EU as an institution, and then it also has bilateral relations with many of the countries, like both your Western as well as Eastern European countries. But as mentioned earlier, in 2012, it tried to pursue a different partnership with only the Central and Eastern European countries, which was problematic. Initially, as mentioned in my presentation, the Central and Eastern European countries were excited to join China's 16+1 strategy, by now, like it's been about almost 10 years, they have seen examples of how Greece was affected and how the other countries came into the fold of PRI. So the 16+1 framework is slowly disintegrating, and as of now, they just have the bilateral relations with individual countries and the EU as a whole.
And just follow up from what you have answered. Now, the recent, as we have seen those reports, the Baltics, 3 countries, they have come out from this 16+1 initiative. So how important do you think this is? I mean, is it, or how important the whole broader 16+ initiative is? And now moving out of these 3 Baltics, will this make any major difference in the ties between Europe and the China?
So in order to answer this question, I'd actually like to borrow Professor Alka Acharya's words, which she had used in a previous presentation. So what ma'am had said was China, though EU is focusing on a single China policy, China prefers to deal with the European countries bilaterally and not the EU as an institution, because it's more beneficial for China if they can negotiate with each of these countries, because each of these countries have their own weaknesses. So for China, pursuing bilateral relations with individual EU countries is definitely a priority. However, having said that, when we talk about the 16+1 strategy alone, initially when it began, it created a lot of fuss. But as has been seen, it's been almost like 8 to 10 years. But we haven't seen anything concrete with just Central and Eastern European countries. It has been a bilateral partnership from China to each of the Baltics or even the Central and Eastern European countries.
Thank you. But I think I have slightly different assessment than what you have said, that China deals or China prefer to deal bilaterally more than actually as EU. Because as you know, any country which is dealing with the European Union and individual member states of the European Union, now there are, as you know, a student of European studies, there are clear-cut competencies defined within the European framework. So in certain areas, you have to deal with the institutions of the European Union. There is no way you can avoid dealing with the European Union. And in other areas, you have to deal bilaterally with major countries. So like when you are negotiating a particular trade deal, you have to deal with the European Union. You can't really do bilaterally with the countries. At the same time, if you are dealing with other areas where competencies are more, say with the member states, like if you're dealing with issues concerning migration or mobility agreements, or even to some extent, I would say counterterrorism, kind of cooperation, etc. Those are the issues where perhaps you can deal more other security issues with perhaps some of the key member states. But of course, China has also used its strong economic ties with some of the key member states to force EU to come with certain kind of agreements. I mean, the background of the China, the comprehensive investment agreement with China and the European Union. So this was it was very clear when the agreement was signed that it was Germany which basically pushed because of its own economic ties with the Europe, with the China. So Angela Merkel was very keen that before German presidency of the European Union moves into the next country, so that she was able to push this. So I mean, yes, I mean they have been, but at the same time, that things are still stuck at the European, even if they were able to use bilaterally. But still, finally, it has to be cleared by the European Union institutions. So unless they are able to deal with the EU institutions, even bilaterally, even with the ties, very strong ties with Germany itself, may not really be able to do the final kind of, I mean, implement.
I think he's facing some network issues.
So maybe any more questions in the chat box?
Yes, ma'am. There are 2 more questions in the chat box.
Okay, so Gulshan, would you like to read them or should I ask Parul?
No.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, so can I read?
Go ahead.
Okay. So to Dr. Preksha only, the question is, okay, by the Beam Subha, does China's engagements with other countries, regime specific here, with Eastern Europe and Western Europe? Does China has any of the engagements with such countries?
So am I connected yet?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
Oh, you can see, okay, because actually there was, there's no electricity. Somehow I'm unable to do something else.
I think
I
so.
mean,
Dr. Preksha lost connectivity.
Okay, Pariksha has lost, not me.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
because I thought since I can just see her frozen picture and my electricity is also gone, I thought it's gone. So anyway, so yeah, sorry, what was the question? If I can.
Yeah. So the second question which I read was, does China engage with any of the other countries which are regime specific? For example, the Eastern Europe and the Western European countries. This is one of the questions.
No, I mean, sorry, I mean, if you can just repeat, I just missed some of the points, what you made.
Okay, so the question here asked was,
Hmm.
does China engage with other countries specifically the Eastern European countries and also the Western European countries?
No, I think she was able to answer this question earlier because, if I understand your question correctly, is that does China deal differently Western European countries and Eastern European countries? Well, one is that, once when we say Eastern or Western, because many of these countries have already become member of the European Union. So obviously, even with certain different interests, I mean, ultimately they have to deal through the European Union institutions as far as the major trade and other investment agreements or other relations are concerned. But of course, every country also has its own bilateral ties, at the same time also different histories, because many of the Central Eastern European countries also had relatively close ties with China during the with the socialist period, because of the very close relations which some of these countries had during this period. Look at, say, for example, Hungary. They have very important historic ties with the China, and in fact, there is also significant, I think, the Chinese diaspora also is in this country. So those are the kind of linkages which have been used, and in the under 16, and that was exactly the whole 16+1 initiative was, when Chinese tried to use some of those linkages and their priorities. Particularly, they wanted different kind of relations. Some of those countries are member of the European Union, some of those countries are still not member of the European Union. So bringing them together, and they thought that it will be relatively easier for many of the Chinese companies to operate in this part of the world compared to when you are dealing with actually the Western European countries and the rules and regulations, etc. there. So that's what, in fact, but it was mutually kind of beneficial, both from the Central Eastern European countries and also from Chinese side. But later on, there were certain worries, and those worries are still there, where now within Europe, it is being seen that China is trying to divide East and West, and they are trying to use some of these countries, and particularly when you have some of those, nationalist governments in some of those countries, to having very close ties with them, and then try to, get some of those issues within the European institutions. But that, in fact, I think, has been the case. But it's not that something they can deal very differently from, because there are 27 countries within the European Union. So they have to deal broadly, not just only economic policy, but there is also strong coordination happening even on political and strategic matters also within these countries.
Sir, Dr. Preksha is facing some network issues, so she's just joining back in a minute. In the meantime, we have 2 more questions. Shall we wait for her to join?
I think, yeah, we can.
Oh dear. No, he's frozen.
Okay, now
just
he's frozen.
I think I'm,
Yeah.
hello?
Okay. Am I audible now or no?
Yes. Both of you are audible.
Okay, all right. So is Preksha joined back? So I can't see her.
Yes.
She's here, but I don't think she's able to turn on her video. So we just have her audio for now. Dr. Preksha, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I've joined through my, yeah.
Okay, can you, there are 1 or 2 questions, Preksha, for you. What was the thing? What was...
Okay, sir, shall I read out the questions for you?
Please read out, Preksha.
Okay, so we have a question from Mr. Omkar Bhole, who asks, what is the present condition of BRI projects in Europe, especially after the pandemic? And is that a significant factor in the China-EU relationship? We all... okay, shall I read out the other question also, and you can take them? So the other question is from Ms. Chandam Tharema. She asks, can you see any area of convergences between Chinese and European interpretations of human rights during their human rights dialogues, or is there no area of agreement at all? These are the 2 questions we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you so much. So regarding the BRI projects, initially when the One Belt, One Road initiative was launched in 2013, EU's response to it was pretty lukewarm. But soon, around 2015 to 2016, it did pick up pace in Europe, and the EU joined the BRI forum as well. However, over time, most of the projects, some of them were successful and some did not do too well. Greece was an example of how the projects were not very successful in a sense. And but then at the same time, there are other individual projects that have been successful, and both EU and China are working towards it. Right now, given the geopolitical changes, European Union has launched its own connectivity strategy. It's called the EU's Asia Connectivity EU Asia Connectivity Project. But this in no way means that its projects that were earlier with BRI, it's not functioning anymore. So EU has also launched this new connectivity projects, but the older projects that it had launched with China, they are functioning, though not very successfully. Was I audible?
Yes. Is there any other? I mean, I don't see any hand further. No, any question? Okay. I don't see any question here. If you can see, please read any.
So, can we take 1 more question? The question was posted on the YouTube.
Just a second. There was also that question on human rights.
Okay, yeah, there was a question on human rights. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see any area of convergence between China and the European interpretation of human rights during the human rights dialogue? So there is no area of agreement at all. Preksha, do you have to say anything on this?
Yes. So as far as the human rights dialogues is concerned, since the dialogue was initiated, both EU and China, the EU believes the UN definition of human rights and it follows it, but China tends to put more emphasis on social or economic rights. But this is a discussion that they have on and off. With regards, as I had demonstrated in my PPT earlier, during discussions on human rights, what happens most is they raise questions on abuse of human rights, which naturally is more, the EU raises questions about human rights abuse happening in China, because one factor is that EU itself is pressured by the European public opinion. For instance, in the case that I'd mentioned earlier about the wife of late Nobel Peace Prize winner, it was international organization as well as organizations based in Germany like Amnesty International, which forced the EU to take such a stand. So this is how the human rights dialogue usually function. It's like the European public opinion pressurizes the government, and then in return, the EU pressurizes China to address its human rights abuse.
Okay, thank you, Preksha. I mean, yes. So this is what broadly the questions so far we had, and she has been able to answer more or less this very clearly. Now, we have finished more or less our time. Now, that if I look at this whole EU-China partnership or strategic partnership or relations, whatever one can call it, one is, of course, is quite clear that they have very strong economic ties, and as a result, both are quite engaged with each other, which is very difficult to disengage despite very difficulties. But I'll just point 2 or 3 things which normally one can see in the narrative now. And those 2 or 3 points have been taken by everyone, by most of the analysts on the China strategy paper, which was released by the European Union 2-3 years back. So 2 or 3 things which they said about China. One was, China and EU both are cooperative partners, number one. Second, they are economic competitors. And the third is systemic rivals. Now, the question is, now everyone is kind of using this. But as a researcher now, the task for us really is, now all these 3 things are true. There is nothing really such very difficult or something really revealing here. One is systemic rival. Now, China and European Union, they are systemic rivals from the very beginning, in the sense that they do follow different systems. There is something new that China follows different political system than the European countries. So they do have those rivalries. Second thing about economic competitors, again, I think they have been, every country is competing with everyone else. And since they are both economic heavyweights, so they will be competing with each other. But I think the real issue which Europe is facing today, my own assessment is that, there's nothing new in economic competition or systemic rivalry between Europe and China. But, in the beginning, when they signed strategic partnership 20 years back, most Europeans, they never thought that actually China will really become such a huge economic competitor of China, in which some of the European technologies will be under threat. So now that's what the worry for them is, that there's nothing new in that economic competition, because every country, every economic power is competing with others. But now economic competition from China to Europe in certain areas is definitely real. That's their worry. And even the systemic rivalry, because now they also feel that China has become such a powerful country that some of the institutions of the global governance, particularly the economic institutions in which Chinese in which Europeans have been dominating most of those decision-making, powers there. So there, China, because of its economic clout, because of economic strength, China is trying to again assert in many of those institutions, or trying to create new institutions, even under BRICS. You have the BRICS Development Bank, etc. So those are the things that you also have systemic rivalry in that sense, really going to hurt somewhere the European interests. And then the question is about cooperative partnership. Then, of course, they do have strong cooperation in many, and not just only in economic areas, and they've clearly identified, whether you look at climate change issues and others, unless China and the European Union, they do cooperate with each other, despite having economic competition and systemic rivalry. So they, they are not, you cannot resolve some of those issues. But still, I think as a researcher, we really have to look into this, to what extent this whole, if this is 100%, and within this 100%, you have these three things, how much is really economic cooperation or a cooperative partnership? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Or is it 80%? We don't know. So that's the one has to really assess of this partnership, and how much the systemic rivalry is really playing out. Is it again, that's what the main kind of aim of Europe and China is, to look at this issue of systemic rivalry, or this is just one of the issues, but other things keep happening. And then to what extent, this economic competition is going to determine their relationship in the coming years and decades. So everyone is kind of trying to use and pick up this from even the European policy papers and use this. But still, we do not know to what extent this is really where the strength of where the strength of cooperative partnership is, and where system rivalry and economic competitor is playing out. So one has to somehow try to, I wouldn't say quantify, because it's very difficult to quantify. One has to see the strength of these three strains basically, and then we'll be able to look at their relationship more in the long term. So this is, I think Professor Alka Acharya would like to say something. I see. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So I would like to just quiz Preksha a bit on triangular situations. Okay, now if we are talking about systemic rivalry, and the assumption is that China and Europe stand together, US and Europe stand together, and that it's really the China challenge. I'd like to ask, to what extent really are the Americans and the Europeans completely united on the China challenge? And particularly when we look at, say, China's presence in Africa, where you have the Americans, you have the Europeans, what are the dynamics there? In other words, I'm interested in seeing that China, EU is one part of the story, or one side of the coin, whereas it's the US-EU convergences regarding China, which is the other side of the coin. And I'm not too sure whether there is a kind of a very strong bond as far as China is concerned. So, Preksha, what do you think about it? And then I'd like Gulshan also to give his views on it.
Ma'am, about the transatlantic partnership on China. So basically, when it comes to China, EU earlier, as for my understanding, their response to China, or sort of their China policy, did converge. But lately, as I discussed in a presentation, the European Union itself is trying to question its own traditional model and gain a bit of a political image as well. Earlier, it was comfortable being just an economic heavyweight, but now it is focusing on becoming a strategic actor as well. And in this, it is shifting from the US-China policy, because the latest example, if we see, was the US sanctions on China in the form of decoupling. And most of the analysts did expect EU to follow suit. but it did not. Instead, what EU did was it came up with its own strategy called China +1, wherein it would not decouple with the Chinese industries, but what it would do is like it would shift focus just from China and shift focus to other countries in Asia when it comes to manufacturing. And what the EU plus China +1 strategy of the EU is that it would let China produce for China, but for other productions, it would also shift focus and slowly but steadily focus towards other Asian countries as well. But it would never go for decoupling as the US did. And when it comes to EU, China, and Africa, or EU, China, and Central Asia, we can't say that EU China's it is an area of convergence, but it is also not an area of divergence for EU and China. So in my thesis, what I've come up with is another area altogether. I've called it the areas of overlapping interests. That means Central Asia as well as Africa. These are areas where interests of China and the European Union overlap, because what we've seen in Africa and both in Central Asia and Africa is that earlier, these are European Union and US, these are traditional players in the region. They have been engaged in the region for longer time than China has. And when they engage in this region, especially EU, it comes with its own baggage. It needs the region to follow democracy. It needs the follower to have high human rights standards. But when China engages with these regions, it's purely economic based. So so there's like no strings attached sort of a policy that China follows. It's purely economics, which is why these countries, or even like earlier we talked about Central and Eastern European countries, they were attracted to Chinese funds more than the European or the US, because it doesn't come with any other political strings attached. So that has been my understanding through this research. I hope that answers the question.
Well, just adding to what Preksha has mentioned, I think Professor Alkacharya has raised a very important, very interesting point. And this triangle business is not just only about China. I think the same is also true with India as well, because if you look at India, EU, China, India, EU, US, and similarly look at China, US, and EU. So this whole thing does affect other relationship. When India's relationship has become very close with the United States, this has definitely affected very positively India's relations with the European Union and other European countries. There's no doubt about this. Similarly, if Chinese relations with the United States are, having some certain issues, and the way the US foreign policy is kind of, focusing more on China. Now that's definitely will have its very serious impact on European relations with China. But now the problem with the European is that the kind of strong economic ties and other investments and all of the kind of linkages what they have developed now with China, particularly like German industry, automobile industry, and other industries, chemical industries. So they can't just allow those tensions to affect their own relations with China. And they are in that sense. I mean, of course, at the same time, they do have certain worries about China's growing role, assertiveness, and also, all the systemic rivalry, etc., all those issues they talk about. But what my feeling is they would like to do is they would like other countries to kind of play that kind of role with China, where China could be under some certain pressure, whether from the United States or from India or from any other country. At the same time, they don't want to get involved here with China on those issues. The same as I was saying, even within the Indo-Pacific whole narrative as well. So they are trying to, balance in that sense their ties with China and also with the United States, and trying to raise those issues. So they would be very vocal in that sense in some of those issues, raising human rights issues, talking about Indo-Pacific, talking about everything, but still they don't want those issues to affect their own economic ties with China. So this is what they would like to do. Whether they'll be able to be very successful in that, that only we'll have to see, because ultimately the European Americans also, they do push very heavily sometime if they really, but at the same time, Americans, they do also have very strong economic interest in China as well. So it's not that they are going to abandon their economic relations with China as well. So one has to just see how things develop over the next few years. But
Yeah.
the US relations definitely does affect ties with other countries as well.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just, since there are no further questions, I'm just going to take this a little further and see what you both would say to this question about the triangular dynamics. You see, the focus becomes so exclusively on the economic and strategic stroke security kind of issues. We generally tend to forget that there is a very strong historico-cultural aspect to Europe's relations with China as compared to the United States. And therefore, there is far more nuance and there is far greater gradations in the way in which the Europeans react to China as compared to the United States, where obviously there is a certain overhang of the whole Cold War dynamics, capitalism versus communism and all the rest. So I was trying to see whether these linkages can actually provide a little more scope for Europe to be flexible as far as handling China is concerned, compared to the United States.
No, I think, I mean, apart from the issues which we have raised about the cultural, historical, and other issues, my feeling is that why. Because then, both, if you look at historically in the last now, say 20, 30 years, or even go even further, the Chinese never thought that the Europeans would really have any kind of, any kind of different kind of interests than in this part of the world. And, they don't really, they really didn't look at any serious kind of strategic kind of threat from Europe to China. The same was also true to some extent, I mean to large extent even for Europe as well, because they never really thought that China could become a major strategic or economic kind of challenge to China, to Europe. So they never really bothered too much. They just tried to use, as China was growing, China was becoming a big economy. They really looked at huge economic opportunities. Their companies invested. It was a big market for Chinese companies to Europe. So they looked at each other's economic strengths as really useful thing. But now, I mean, still to some extent, those things are still happening. But now only thing what one is seeing is that under certain, the narrative which has been built on the last few years, and also the way China has behaved in some of the in the last few years within this whole region, and also internationally. So there are some worries within Europe that it could really become threat in some of the industries, not really to become main economic threat, but in some of the technologies, in some of the industries, they do have real competition from China. But at the same time, as one of the Chinese ambassadors in Germany, I think he was mentioning when there were discussions about 5G and, that since now Europe will develop its own 5G, they don't need to depend on China. And I think he also said, in a very subtle way that, it means that if we, I don't remember exactly what he said, but what he said was that, if we do, I mean, we shouldn't really say that, since we are also now producing cars in China, so we should not be really, importing or working with the German or European companies to produce cars in China. So in a sense, he was trying to give a subtle message that your companies, where you have a kind of comparative advantage Because, for all the, major automobile companies, China is a big market. So it's not that China is not producing cars. China is producing cars, but still we are also producing all the European cars there, and for Europe, it's a big market. Similarly, in some of the technologies, whether it's 5G, etc., if you produce your own technologies, it doesn't mean that, you just kind of cut our technologies into your market, because the market has its own way of functioning. So, you might have certain advantage in some areas. In some areas, we would like to, kind of compete or work along with your own companies in the European market. So, so that's the way, kind of, they are looking at certain technologies, because both are producing all those technologies. It's not that Europe is really inferior to some of those technologies in any way. I mean, they may in some area that there's a certain challenge Chinese companies would face, but they'll still be competing with each other in some of those, and those are again big markets. So they have to really work in that way, that they start work, instead of cutting each other, looking at both markets as strength, as they have been looking. This is what the China has been arguing, but under certain pressure from the US and also certain narrative within Europe itself, the many policymakers and many think tanks in Europe have also started talking very hawkishly about China. So how this is going to affect their future relations with China, still it's uncertain, but it's to some extent it has already started affecting. They are getting worried. They're trying to stick their investment in certain areas. So those are the things that are already started happening.
Well, thanks.
Big areas.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, well, it's very interesting that you bring out those very finer details of the relationship. But I take it, therefore, that you do not really give much credence or importance to the historical-cultural aspect. I mean, would Preksha actually have anything different to say on this, or would she also say the same thing roughly? Yes.
Initially, when you asked the question, I had a different. I thought of a different answer, but I do agree with what Professor Sachdeva has said. I initially thought when you posed the question, that when it comes to historical linkages, and because of which how US deals with China and how EU deals with China is different. In my understanding, it was not more because of the historical linkages that Europe shares with China, but because of the way that maybe EU was formed as an institution. Initially, of course, it was not strong. It only focused because it culminated because of the end of the war. EU focused only on prosperity and economics, which is why they had this sort of an unconditional engagement with China. They also felt that if they continue to engage with China for long enough, then maybe they would bring China into the fold of like being another democracy. But now it's pretty clear that China does not intend to sort of change its own system. And the EU is also EU has taken time, but it has understood that China has no intention of changing, like at least when it comes to its system. So that was my answer. But of course, Professor Gulshan Sachdeva's answer is much more concrete, and I agree with it.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, basically they are looking more, the kind of issues which are being raised now. These are about, more about how future technologies and future relationship, and where do they stand global geopolitics, in which these, because now historically Europe never thought that China would become a threat economically and or technologically to them. It was a developing country. I mean, they were growing, it's an opportunity. But now, I mean, that's the only thing which will affect to some extent. But still, it's a, but if China does not grow the way it used to grow earlier, it doesn't provide that many opportunities, or it become more protectionist, more closed, then they would perhaps will have less of interest in China. But if China continue to grow, continue to be open, and in that context, I think, the investment agreement was very useful for both of them, because there China gave very kind of say lucrative kind of areas open for European companies. So the Europe, all the kind of criticism which was there before that they are not giving market access to this area, that area, so something, and China was able to just give them, and then they, kept kind of, they were happy with that, and Germans were particularly very happy. But since then, the geopolitics has taken over. Now, of course, the Ukraine, etc., US-China war, which has again affected, which was really beneficial for both of China and Europe. So that's something that the broader trends of geopolitics and technologies and the threat perceptions from China, that is going to affect, the future ties between Europe and China.
All right. So maybe the co-hosts out here, Shruti or Parul or somebody. How much?
Yes, ma'am, we're out of time now. So,
all right.
If there are no further questions, I'll close the meeting.
Yeah. So I don't know. Any last words, Preksha?
No, ma'am. I'd just like to thank you and Professor Sachdeva for the questions and answers as well.
Yeah, I hope your electricity has come back, Gulshan. You were sweating.
Yeah, no. In fact, there was in between, there was no electricity, so I'm on mobile. I'm actually. Okay, but it's working fine.
No, in between, I noticed you were sweating, and I thought how delicious the irony that this is the first time I'm seeing the student speaking and the supervisor sweating. Otherwise, it's the other way around. Okay, thanks so much. And maybe Parul can make a final thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think it was very useful discussion, and we'll continue to have, this relationship will continue to develop. And it's useful because looking from Chinese perspective and the European perspective, that obviously sitting in India, we are looking mainly from Indian perspective, what is really happening and how this is going to affect our ties with Europe or with China. But this is an interesting way of looking, because otherwise we just look at either our relations with China or with Europe, and then we forget other things are also happening and how they are dealing their ties with others, and there are plenty of things to learn. And particularly, I definitely believe the way I think China has invested in learning European institutions, and the way European institutions function for the last 20-25 years. They are really trying to, and I think this has somewhere, this has also helped them in some of their policy making with the European Union. Things are happening in India, but we are still, I think we have to catch up. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Parul, do you want to?
Ma'am, Parul is facing some. Parul, are you there?
Yeah. So can you hear me? Finally?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So okay. Sorry for the interruptions in the beginning of the meeting. Extremely sorry for that. So, okay. Thank you all, especially our eminent speaker and the chair. Both were excellent, and they provided us with the great thought-provoking talks. And also Professor Alka Acharya also for her inputs. And I would also like to thank all the participants for the patience and the cooperation. Thank you, and have a nice evening.